To anyone looking in from the outside, my life seemed perfect. A beautiful home in the suburbs, a husband with a stable career, a mother-in-law who volunteered at church every Sunday morning without fail. Strangers at the grocery store would stop me mid-aisle and say, "You're so lucky, honey. You really landed on your feet." And every single time I smiled. I was exceptionally good at smiling. It was perhaps the one skill I perfected during those years, the ability to arrange my face into something warm and reassuring, while everything underneath quietly came apart. My husband proposed to me on a Tuesday. Not a meaningful Tuesday, not our anniversary or my birthday or even a weekend when the mood might have been right. A Tuesday in February, in the parking lot of an Olive Garden, after an ordinary dinner where nothing remarkable had been said. He looked at me across the hood of his car and said the words almost casually, the way you'd ask someone to pass the salt. "I think we should get married." I said yes. I don't know why I'm still faintly embarrassed by that memory. I was 28 years old. I had a job I genuinely loved, project coordinator at a mid-size marketing firm downtown, the kind of work that made Monday mornings feel purposeful. I had my own apartment, small but entirely mine, with a window that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the whole place feel golden at 4 o'clock. I had a savings account, a gym membership I actually used, and a group of girlfriends who made me laugh until my stomach ached. I was a full, functioning person with a life that belonged to her. Within 18 months of saying yes in that parking lot, I had almost none of those things left. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. That's the part people don't understand when they hear stories like mine. They imagine a single dramatic moment, a door slamming, a clear before and after. But that's not how it works. It works slowly, through small requests and smaller suggestions, through the gentle erosion of things you barely notice losing, until one day you reach for them and they're simply gone. My mother-in-law suggested it would make more financial sense if we moved into the family home. She had the space. We could save for a house of our own. My husband thought it was a wonderful idea. I thought it was temporary. I packed up my apartment, said goodbye to that golden afternoon light, and told myself 6 months, maybe a year at most. That was 3 years before everything finally broke open. The job was next. Not because anyone fired me, not because I failed at anything, but because my mother-in-law needed help around the house, and my husband's schedule was unpredictable, and someone needed to be available. "You can always go back to work later," my husband told me, with that infuriating reasonableness of his, that calm, measured tone that made every unreasonable thing sound like simple logic. "We make enough." I handed in my 2 weeks' notice and cried the entire drive home, tears blurring the road in front of me, and then I walked through the front door and made dinner and set the table, and not a single person in that house asked me how I was feeling. Not once. I want you to understand what those 3 years actually felt like before I tell you what happened, because I think people hear stories like mine, and their first instinct is to ask why I didn't just leave. And the honest, unglamorous answer is that I forgot I was allowed to. I forgot what my own voice sounded like when it wasn't apologizing or over-explaining or carefully reshaping itself to fit whatever the room needed. I forgot that I had once been a person with opinions and ambitions and a savings account with my own name on it. I forgot, in the most fundamental way possible, that I existed as someone separate from the needs of that household. My mother-in-law ran the house the way a general commands a military base. Her kitchen, her rules, her schedule, her standards, her silences that communicated entire paragraphs of disappointment without a single word. If I folded the towels incorrectly, she would refold them in front of me, slowly and deliberately, with that expression, patient, pitying, the way you look at a child who keeps knocking over her glass. My husband witnessed all of it. He said nothing. That was the thing about him that took me the longest to find the right word for. He wasn't a cruel man, not in the ways people typically mean when they use that word. He was simply absent. Physically present in every room, emotionally unreachable in all of them, like a building where every light has been switched off. I started noticing things about a year before everything finally unraveled. Small things at first, easy to dismiss, easy to explain away. He stayed late at work more frequently. He became careful with his phone, not dramatically secretive, just careful, in a new way, a certain angle when I walked into a room, a brief pause before answering questions that didn't require pausing. I filed these observations away the way you file receipts you're not certain you'll need. Quietly, and without conclusion. Then one evening in March, while he was in the shower, his phone lit up on the nightstand. I wasn't looking for anything. I was walking past, but I saw the name and I saw the first two lines of the message and my entire body went very still. Her name was Danielle. I didn't know a Danielle, but apparently my husband knew her quite well indeed. I placed the phone back exactly where it was. I went downstairs. I made tea. I never drank. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time, and what I felt in those quiet minutes was not what I had expected. I had expected devastation, the sharp cinematic grief of the trail. What I felt instead was something much quieter, much stranger, almost like clarity. Like the moment your eyes finally adjust in a dark room and you can suddenly see with perfect precision the shape of the space you've been standing in all along. I had been here already. I simply hadn't had a name for it yet. I said nothing, not yet. I needed to think clearly and carefully because here is what nobody tells you about being financially dependent on someone. It isn't only love that holds you in place. It's logistics. Cold, practical, unglamorous logistics. I had no income. My name was not on the mortgage. I had approximately $400 in a personal account my mother-in-law didn't know existed, money I had been quietly, carefully setting aside from grocery change over the course of 2 years. $400 and a college degree that had been sitting unused long enough to feel like a relic from someone else's life. So I did what I should have done 3 years earlier. I made a plan. I called Renee, my oldest friend, the one who had been gently, carefully worried about me for years without ever pushing hard enough to push me away, which was its own kind of love. I called her from my car, parked 2 blocks from the house, engine running, and I told her everything, all of it, every small erosion, every refolded towel, every dinner where I'd smiled until my face ached. She didn't say I told you so. She just said, quietly and without hesitation, "Okay, what do you need?" Over the following 6 weeks, Renee helped me update my resume. I applied for jobs using her address. I opened a new bank account at a different branch with a different institution. I gathered documents quietly and systematically, my social security card, my passport, copies of our joint financial statements, anything Patricia might eventually need. I kept everything at Renee's house. I told no one. I waited. My husband, in the meantime, had grown bolder with the particular boldness of a man who believes he is getting away with something. The late evenings became more frequent. He began traveling for work or claiming to travel for work. He bought new clothes. He seemed genuinely happier, lighter in a way I hadn't seen in years, and I understood with great clarity what was producing that lightness. My mother-in-law noticed the change in him and attributed it to reduced stress at the office. I nodded and cleared the dinner plates and kept my expression exactly where it needed to be. Then one Thursday evening, my husband came home and sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, with that same reasonable, measured calm that had always made the unreasonable sound inevitable, that he had invited a colleague to stay in the guest room for a few weeks. Her apartment building was undergoing renovations. She needed somewhere temporary. He hoped that was all right. I looked at him for a long, steady moment. I thought about several things I could have said. "Of course," I said instead. "Whatever you need." I watched his shoulders drop about an inch with relief. He had been bracing for a confrontation. He didn't know me very well anymore. Or perhaps he never had. Danielle arrived on a Saturday afternoon with 2 designer suitcases and the kind of easy, unthinking confidence that comes from being very beautiful and knowing it for a long time. She was perhaps 30, dark hair, a smile that landed differently on a husband than on a wife. My mother-in-law was charmed within approximately 4 minutes. She said Danielle reminded her of someone. She didn't specify who, but she said it warmly, as though it were a compliment. I thought about pointing out exactly who Danielle reminded me of, which was no one who had any business in this house, but I smiled instead. I was still very good at smiling. That first week was a particular kind of humiliation that I won't describe in full detail because it doesn't deserve more space than the brief acknowledgement that it was deliberate and it was witnessed and it was allowed. Looks exchanged across the dinner table that I was meant to catch. Comments, gentle and plausibly deniable about my cooking, my appearance, my apparent lack of direction. My mother-in-law began, subtly but unmistakably, to defer to Danielle in household conversations, the way she had previously deferred to no one but herself. My husband laughed at Danielle's stories in the unguarded, easy way he had not laughed in my presence in years. And I sat at the table I had set and ate the food I had helped prepare and watched my own marriage proceed without me, and I thought, very calmly, soon. What none of them knew was that 4 days earlier, on a Wednesday afternoon, sitting in my car outside a coffee shop 3 miles from the house, I had accepted a job offer. Marketing manager at a firm across town, more seniority and considerably better pay than the position I had left 3 years ago. The start date was in 3 weeks. Renee and I had identified an apartment, affordable and close to the new office, available on the 1st of the month. I had met with Patricia, the family law attorney Renee had recommended, a calm and methodical woman who wore reading glasses on a beaded chain and discussed asset division the way other people discuss weather forecasts, factually and without drama. Everything was in place. All that remained was the moment. What I had not planned and what I want to be honest about, because the best parts of this story were genuinely not my doing, was Marcus. Marcus was Renee's cousin. I had met him once, briefly, at her birthday party 2 years earlier, before I had retreated so completely into that house that I had stopped attending birthday parties altogether. He was in town for work and staying with Renee for the weekend. When I stopped by to drop off some documents, he was in the kitchen making coffee and we talked for an hour and a half at her kitchen table without either of us noticing the time passing. He was easy to be around. He was funny without performing at it. He asked questions and then actually listened to the answers, which had become, I realized with some sadness, surprisingly rare in my life. I drove home that evening feeling something I hadn't felt in so long I had nearly forgotten it had a name. I felt like myself. I want to be precise about what Marcus was and was not at that point. He was not a plan. He was not a rebound. He was not leverage or strategy or any of the things people sometimes assume when a woman has a man in the wings during a marriage's collapse. He was a person who treated me like I was worth listening to, and at that particular point in my life, that was almost shockingly uncommon. We exchanged numbers, we texted carefully and without rushing anything. But when the evening came, that changed everything. He was there, and that matters, even if it matters simply because someone choosing to show up matters. 2 weeks after Danielle moved in, my mother-in-law announced she was hosting a small dinner. A few neighbors, a family friend, an occasion for everyone to become better acquainted with Danielle, as though the rest of us had not been living with the situation for 14 days already. I agreed to it the way I had agreed to nearly everything in those years. And I agreed because I had also realized, somewhere in the quiet of the previous week, that this dinner was going to be the moment I had been waiting for. I texted Marcus. I explained briefly and honestly that I was in the process of closing a chapter of my life and that I could use a friendly face in the room. He didn't ask for elaboration. He said, "What time?" I told him 7:30, just after dinner had begun, because I wanted him to walk in when the room was settled and comfortable and unsuspecting. The dinner unfolded exactly as I expected. Danielle wore a red dress. My mother-in-law had prepared her famous pot roast, which she had not made for my birthday in 3 consecutive years. My husband filled Danielle's wine glass before he thought to fill mine. The neighbors talked cheerfully about the development project on Route 9 and the possibility of new soccer fields at the elementary school. I sat at my table and played my role and watched the room and waited. At 7:25, my phone lit up with a text. Marcus outside. I placed my napkin on the table, stood up quietly and mentioned that I had forgotten to mention I'd invited a friend this evening. I hoped that was all right. My husband looked at me with something brief and unreadable in his expression. My mother-in-law looked as though I had announced a sudden intention to rearrange the furniture. Danielle said nothing. She was looking at her wine glass. I walked to the front door and opened it. Marcus was standing on the front step in a jacket, holding a bottle of wine I hadn't asked him to bring, and when he saw me, he smiled the way people smile when they are genuinely glad to see you, without agenda or performance. I stepped aside and said, "Come in," and we walked back into the dining room together. I watched Danielle the way you watch something you want to remember with complete precision, the way you watch the final scene of a film you know will stay with you. I watched her glance up when we entered. I watched the glance sharpen into a stare. I watched the color drain from her face, not flush red, but something more interesting, a pale, trapped stillness like someone who has just heard a sound they cannot immediately explain. And then she said it. Not a scream, not the dramatic moment I might have imagined in a different version of this story. Just a single word, dropped into the room like something heavy falling from a great height. His name. She said his name. Marcus stopped walking. He looked at her the way you look at someone you haven't thought about in some time and suddenly cannot stop thinking about. He said her name in return. His voice was entirely even. "What are you doing here?" The table went completely quiet. The neighbors exchanged a glance. My mother-in-law set her fork down with a small, careful click against the china. What unfolded in the next 10 minutes was not something I could have written or choreographed or predicted in any detail. Danielle and Marcus had been married, past tense. Their divorce had finalized 4 months earlier, after she had, in the calm and factual account Marcus offered much later that night, moved out of their shared apartment to pursue other arrangements. He had not known what those arrangements were. He had not known whose guest room she was occupying or why. He had suspected she was involved with someone. He had not suspected he would be standing in that someone's dining room on the Thursday evening holding a bottle of Merlot. My husband had gone very still in his chair, the specific stillness of a person trying to determine whether what is happening is actually happening. My mother-in-law was looking at Danielle with an expression I had genuinely never seen cross her face in 3 years. Uncertainty, slow and searching and fundamental, like a structure discovering for the first time that its foundation is softer than it appeared. Danielle stood up from the table. She said she could explain. She looked at Marcus, then at my husband, then at my mother-in-law, and then, just once and briefly, at me. I looked back at her pleasantly with the serene expression of a woman who has nothing left to lose and knows it. "I need to use the restroom," she said. She walked out of the dining room. 30 seconds later, I heard the front door close. My husband pushed back his chair and stood. He said her name once, toward the direction she had gone. Then he sat back down. He did not go after her. That, I realized, in the silence that followed, was the saddest and most revealing thing I had ever witnessed in him. Not the lying, not the years of careful emotional absence, not the breathtaking audacity of moving his mistress into our shared home. This, that when the moment arrived, he simply sat back down. The neighbors made their exits approximately 20 minutes later, with the polished, hurried grace of people who have witnessed something they will be discussing for the next 6 months. My mother-in-law began clearing the dishes. Nobody spoke about what had just occurred. I found that almost funny. I excused myself and went upstairs. I finished something I had begun quietly 2 nights before. I packed a single bag, not because that was all I intended to take, but because that was all I needed for tonight. The rest had already been arranged. The apartment, the job, the documents at Renee's house, the attorney named Patricia with her beaded chain, and her matter-of-fact assessment of what I was entitled to. 3 years of patience, of quietly building in secret, of preserving just enough of myself to eventually walk out a door. I came back downstairs with the bag over my shoulder. My husband was in the living room. He looked at the bag and then, for what felt like the first time in a very long time, he actually looked at me. "Where are you going?" he said. "I'm leaving," I said. "I'm leaving," I said. He said we should talk about it. I told him we should have talked about it years ago. I told him my attorney's name was Patricia and that he would hear from her the following week. He started to say something further. I watched his mouth open and then stop, as though he had thought better of it, or perhaps as though he had finally seen something in my face that told him there was no version of this conversation where I changed my mind. My mother-in-law was standing in the kitchen doorway holding a dish towel. looking at me with an expression I had never seen directed at me before. She looked, for the first time in 3 years, as though she didn't know what to say. I thought briefly about saying something pointed, something that would land and leave a mark. I decided against it. She was going to have more than enough to think about without any help from me. "Good night," I said. I walked to the front door and I walked through it, and I did not look back, not out of drama or symbolism, but because there was genuinely nothing in that direction I needed to see anymore. Marcus was still in the driveway. I had not asked him to wait. He had waited anyway. He looked at me and said, "You okay?" I stood in the cool night air and took honest stock of my situation. 1 bag, a job starting in 11 days. An apartment key on my keychain, and an attorney named Patricia and a friend named Renee, who had never, in all the years I had been making myself disappear, stopped believing I would eventually find my way back. "Yeah," I said. And I meant it in a way I had not meant a simple answer in a very long time. "I really am." He drove me to Renee's that night, and we talked the entire way. The easy, unforced way of 2 people who have something real to build, rather than something desperate to hold on to. I didn't cry until I got inside and Renee put her arms around me, and then I cried for a long time. Not from sadness exactly, but from the specific and profound relief of setting something down that you have been carrying so long you forgot it was never supposed to be yours to carry in the first place. The divorce was not simple. Divorces rarely are, regardless of the circumstances. Patricia was as methodical and unflappable as advertised, and my husband proved more cooperative than I had anticipated, possibly because he was occupied with his own separate reckoning. It emerged in the weeks that followed that Danielle had been involved with 2 other men simultaneously alongside my husband. The particular irony of a man being deceived by his own mistress was not lost on me. I allowed myself exactly 1 quiet, private laugh about it alone in my new apartment before closing that chapter with finality. I started my new job on a Monday morning. I took the train in. I wore a blazer I had purchased with the first paycheck deposited into my own account, sat down at a desk that was mine, in an office where no one needed me to make myself smaller, opened my laptop, and started. That was 8 months ago now. The woman who cried in her car over a resignation letter feels like someone I knew a long time ago. I remember her clearly, and I don't judge her, but I don't live there anymore. I want to say one thing directly, clearly, without softening it, to anyone who is currently in the middle of their own version of what I have just described. Not the mistress, not the dinner party, not the twist of coincidence that made for a cleaner ending than most people get. The part that comes before all of that, the years of making yourself incrementally smaller, the gradual surrender of your job, your income, your friendships, your name on your own accounts, the quiet daily practice of disappearing. You are not stupid for having stayed. I was not stupid for staying. We do what feels survivable in the moment, and sometimes survival looks like stillness, and stillness can look from the outside like surrender, but it isn't always. Sometimes it is simply the patient work of building enough of a foundation beneath your feet to eventually stand on. The foundation, though, has to be yours. Not his, not theirs, not held in joint custody with someone who can revoke access at any moment. Keep your job or do whatever is necessary to get it back. Keep your own accounts or open new ones today. Keep at least 1 friend who tells you the truth even when the truth is inconvenient. The kind of friend who says, "Okay, what do you need?" and means it without condition. These things are not small things. In the architecture of a life that belongs to you, these things are the structure itself. Renee told me recently that I sound different now. I asked her different how, and she was quiet for a moment, genuinely considering it. Then she said, "Like yourself again." I told her I'd take that. I will take that without qualification, without reservation, with both hands. It is, in the end, the only thing that was ever actually mine to begin with.